The reconnaissance patrol from the 7th Panzer Division's Advanced Battalion reached the eastern bank of the Dnieper River at 0523 hours on June 23, 1944, exactly 3 years to the day after Operation Barbarossa had begun Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union. Obergefreiter Hans Kleist crouched behind the shattered remains of a Soviet T-34 tank, its turret blown clean off by a direct hit from an 88mm anti-tank gun during the German retreat 2 weeks earlier, and raised his field glasses to scan the seemingly empty landscape stretching eastward toward Minsk. Through the morning mist rising from the river, the rolling hills of Belorussia appeared peaceful, almost pastoral, with scattered farmhouses and grain fields that showed no sign of military activity. But Kleist had spent 3 years fighting on the Eastern Front, and he knew that the absence of visible enemy forces meant nothing when dealing with the Red Army. The 7th Panzer Division's Reconnaissance Battalion had been tasked with determining Soviet strength and positions east of the Dnieper crossing near Orsha, as part of Army Group Center's desperate attempt to establish a defensive line that might halt the massive Red Army offensive that intelligence reports suggested was imminent. General Heinz Guderian's staff had received fragmentary intelligence indicating that Marshal Georgy Zhukov was concentrating unprecedented numbers of tanks, artillery pieces, and infantry divisions in the forests east of the Dnieper, but the exact scale and timing of the Soviet buildup remained unknown. The Reconnaissance Battalion's mission was to penetrate Soviet lines, gather intelligence on enemy dispositions, and return with information that might allow German commanders to position their increasingly limited reserves where they would have maximum defensive impact. Kleist's squad consisted of 12 men from the 7th Panzer Division's Reconnaissance Battalion, all veterans of the brutal fighting that had characterized the Eastern Front since 1941. Unteroffizier Wolfgang Richter, the squad leader, had fought in the initial advance on Moscow, survived the catastrophic winter retreat of 1941-42, and participated in the failed offensive at Kursk the previous summer. Obergefreiter Kurt Steinberg carried the squad's MG-42 machine gun, a weapon capable of firing 1,200 rounds per minute and devastating infantry attacks, but useless against the T-34s and IS-2 heavy tanks that increasingly dominated Soviet armored formations. The rest of the squad carried Karabiner 98K rifles, Gur 43 semi-automatic rifles, and a single Panzerfaust anti-tank weapon that might penetrate Soviet armor at ranges under 50 meters. The river crossing had been accomplished using inflatable boats under cover of darkness, with the entire reconnaissance patrol consisting of 48 men from 3 squads crossing the Dnieper at a point where Soviet patrols had been observed to be relatively infrequent. The operation was planned to last no more than 12 hours, with the patrol penetrating approximately 10 kilometers into Soviet-held territory before returning with intelligence on enemy positions and strength. But as Kleist studied the terrain through his field glasses, he noticed details that suggested the mission was based on fundamentally flawed assumptions about Soviet capabilities and intentions. The farmhouses scattered across the landscape showed no signs of civilian habitation, but neither did they show signs of recent combat damage. Windows were intact, roofs undamaged, but no smoke rose from chimneys despite the cool morning air that would normally require heating fires. More significantly, the roads visible through his field glasses showed no signs of civilian traffic, no farmers moving livestock or peasants traveling to market. The entire area appeared to have been evacuated, which suggested either that Soviet forces had cleared the civilian population in preparation for defensive operations, or that the Red Army was planning something that would make the region uninhabitable for non-combatants. Richter's radio operator, Funker Gerd Hoffmann, had been monitoring Soviet radio transmissions throughout the river crossing and early morning advance, using German-produced radio equipment captured during the 1941 offensive and modified to receive Red Army communications. The intelligence he gathered painted a disturbing picture of Soviet activity that contradicted the peaceful appearance of the landscape. Soviet radio traffic had increased dramatically during the past 48 hours, with multiple armored and infantry divisions reporting positions and coordinating movements in a pattern that suggested massive troop concentrations were being assembled in precisely the region where the German Reconnaissance Patrol was now operating. The first indication that the 7th Panzer Division's Reconnaissance Battalion had walked into a carefully prepared trap came at 0647 hours, when Kleist observed Soviet artillery observers taking positions in a church steeple approximately 2 kilometers to the northeast. The 2 men were clearly visible through his field glasses as they set up what appeared to be radio equipment and began systematically scanning the surrounding countryside with binoculars. Their presence indicated that Soviet forces were not only aware of the German patrol's location, but were actively tracking their movements and probably coordinating with artillery batteries positioned beyond visual range. Richter made the tactical decision that would determine whether his squad survived the next several hours. Rather than continue with the original mission of advancing deeper into Soviet territory, he ordered his men to take cover in a destroyed farmhouse and observe Soviet movements while maintaining radio silence. The squad's radio operator would monitor enemy communications while the rest of the men established defensive positions and prepared for what appeared to be inevitable contact with superior enemy forces. The decision reflected hard-won experience with Soviet tactics, which increasingly emphasized allowing German units to penetrate apparently empty territory before surrounding and destroying them with overwhelming firepower. At 0712 hours, the peaceful morning silence was shattered by the distinctive sound of Soviet artillery batteries firing in unison from positions at least 15 kilometers distant. The characteristic whistle of incoming 152 mm howitzer shells filled the air as the barrage bracketed the farmhouse where Kleist's squad had taken cover, with explosions walking systematically across the landscape in a pattern clearly designed to prevent escape rather than achieve immediate destruction. The Soviet gunners were demonstrating their ability to target any point within several square kilometers, effectively trapping the German patrol in a killing zone where movement would draw concentrated artillery fire. Hoffmann's radio interceptions revealed the scope of the trap that had been prepared for the 7th Panzer Division's Reconnaissance Battalion. Soviet communications indicated that at least 3 Red Army divisions were positioned in a semicircle around the area where the German patrol had crossed the Dnieper, with artillery support from 2 separate battery groups and air support from ground attack aircraft of the 1st Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment. The reconnaissance mission had been anticipated and planned for, with Soviet forces allowing the Germans to cross the river and advance inland before closing the trap with coordinated fires that would prevent retreat to the Dnieper crossing point. The scale of Soviet preparation became fully apparent when T-34 tanks from the 11th Guards Tank Corps began appearing on the ridgelines surrounding the trapped German patrol. Kleist counted at least 16 tanks moving into positions that would provide interlocking fields of fire across the entire area where the Reconnaissance Battalion was operating. The tanks moved with disciplined precision, maintaining intervals and supporting distances that indicated months of training in coordinated operations. These were not the desperate, poorly trained crews that had characterized early war Soviet armored units, but experienced tankers operating advanced equipment with tactical sophistication that rivaled German panzer formations. Richter's attempts to coordinate with the other squads from the Reconnaissance Battalion revealed that the trap encompassed the entire German force. Radio communications from Unteroffizier Klaus Weber's squad, operating 2 kilometers to the south, reported contact with Soviet infantry in at least company strength, supported by multiple anti-tank guns and mortar teams. Obergefreiter Paul Schmidt's squad, advancing toward a village 4 kilometers northeast of the river crossing, had come under attack from concealed machine gun positions and was requesting immediate artillery support that could not be provided due to the distance from friendly lines. The tactical situation facing the 7th Panzer Division's Reconnaissance Battalion admitted no optimistic interpretation. 48 German soldiers armed with individual weapons and 1 machine gun per squad were trapped in open terrain by Soviet forces that included at least 3 infantry divisions, 1 tank corps, and multiple artillery battalions. The nearest German units capable of providing support were positioned west of the Dnieper River, separated from the reconnaissance patrol by at least 20 kilometers of Soviet-controlled territory, and the river crossing that was now certainly under enemy observation and fire control. At 0834 hours, Soviet ground attack aircraft from the 1st Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment began systematic attacks on German positions, using Ilyushin Il-2 Sturmovik aircraft armed with 23 mm cannons, rockets, and anti-personnel bombs. The aircraft operated in pairs, with 1 Sturmovik making attack runs while the second provided cover against German anti-aircraft fire that consisted primarily of individual rifles and the squad machine gun. The pilots demonstrated familiarity with German defensive tactics, attacking from multiple directions to prevent concentrated defensive fire, and using terrain features to mask their approach until the final attack phase. Kleist's observation of Soviet operations revealed tactical sophistication that indicated fundamental changes in Red Army capabilities since the early years of the war. Artillery fire was precisely coordinated with ground movements, with Soviet infantry advancing under protective barrages that lifted and shifted as the troops reached each successive objective. Tank movements were synchronized with infantry attacks, providing fire support and exploitation capabilities that demonstrated integration between different combat arms. Most significantly, Soviet radio communications were conducted using codes that changed frequently and indicated professional military education and training at levels comparable to German standards. The first casualties in Kleist's squad occurred at 0913 hours, when a direct hit from a Soviet 120mm mortar round landed in the farmhouse courtyard, where two men had been attempting to establish an observation post. Obergefreiter Martin Düring and Schütze Peter Kohl were killed instantly by the explosion, which also wounded Gefreiter Franz Müller with shell fragments that severed arteries in his left leg. The mortar attack was followed immediately by coordinated small arms fire from Soviet infantry, who had infiltrated to within 100 meters of the German position under cover of the artillery barrage. Richter's defensive plan reflected the tactical realities facing a squad-sized unit surrounded by superior enemy forces. The men would maintain their position in the farmhouse ruins as long as ammunition lasted, calling artillery and air support that they knew could not be provided, while hoping that German forces west of the Dnieper might organize a relief operation. The alternative of attempting to fight their way back to the river crossing was mathematically impossible given the Soviet forces positioned between their current location and the escape route. The machine gun position established by Steinberg and his assistant gunner provided the squad's primary defensive firepower, but ammunition expenditure had to be carefully controlled to prevent running out of bullets before the battle ended. The MG-42's theoretical rate of fire of 1,200 rounds per minute was meaningless when the squad's total ammunition supply consisted of fewer than 2,000 rounds distributed across 12 men. Effective defensive fire required precise target selection and fire discipline that would make every bullet count against attackers who appeared to have unlimited ammunition supplies. Soviet infantry tactics demonstrated sophisticated understanding of German defensive capabilities and limitations. Rather than conducting massed frontal attacks that would present targets for concentrated defensive fire, Red Army troops advanced in small groups using terrain features and smoke screens to approach German positions from multiple directions simultaneously. The attacks were coordinated with artillery fire missions that forced German defenders to take cover at precisely the moments when infantry assault teams were most vulnerable to defensive fire. At 1,027 hours, T-34 tanks from the 11th Guards Tank Corps began direct fire missions against the farmhouse where Kleist's squad had established their defensive position. The 762mm tank guns were highly effective against the stone and timber construction that provided the Germans' only protection, with individual rounds capable of penetrating walls and creating deadly clouds of stone fragments and wooden splinters. Tank fire was systematically directed at each room of the farmhouse, forcing the German defenders to relocate constantly while under continuous attack from infantry and artillery. Hoffmann's radio monitoring revealed that Soviet forces were treating the destruction of the German Reconnaissance Patrol as a training exercise for larger operations planned against Army Group Center. Radio communications referenced tactical lessons learned and procedures refined during the engagement, suggesting that the trapped German soldiers were providing valuable combat experience for Red Army units preparing for major offensive operations. The reconnaissance mission had become an unwitting contribution to Soviet military education at the cost of German lives. The Panzerfaust anti-tank weapon carried by Gefreiter Heinrich Braun represented the squad's only capability for engaging Soviet armor at ranges where defensive fire might be effective. But the weapon's maximum effective range of 50 meters meant that successful employment required allowing enemy tanks to approach to distances where their superior firepower and protection provided overwhelming advantages. The mathematical probability of a single Panzerfaust achieving decisive results against multiple T-34 tanks fell somewhere between remote and impossible. Richter's tactical assessment of the situation led to the conclusion that the squad's mission had shifted from intelligence gathering to providing intelligence about Soviet capabilities to higher headquarters through radio communications that would be monitored by German intelligence services. The information they could provide about Red Army tactics, equipment, and organization might prove valuable for future defensive operations, even though the reconnaissance patrol itself was clearly doomed to destruction. At 1,156 hours, Soviet artillery began preparatory fires for what appeared to be a coordinated assault involving both tanks and infantry. The barrage concentrated on the farmhouse and surrounding area with unprecedented intensity, delivering an estimated 200 rounds of mixed artillery and mortar fire within a 10-minute period. The psychological impact of concentrated artillery fire was as devastating as the physical destruction, creating a sensory environment where rational thought became difficult and coordinated defensive action nearly impossible. The final assault began at 1,211 hours with T-34 tanks advancing to within direct fire range while Soviet infantry moved to assault positions under cover of smoke screens and continued artillery support. Kleist watched through a gap in the farmhouse wall as at least 30 Red Army soldiers approached from 3 different directions, their movements coordinated by radio communications and hand signals that indicated professional military training and leadership. The attacking force represented overwhelming numerical superiority supported by armor and artillery that the German squad had no capability to engage effectively. Steinberg's MG-42 machine gun provided devastating defensive fire against the initial infantry assault, with the weapon's high rate of fire creating a beaten zone that prevented Soviet troops from advancing across open ground toward the farmhouse. But concentrated return fire from multiple Soviet weapons positions quickly zeroed in on the machine gun's location, and a direct hit from a tank round destroyed both the weapon and its crew at 1,218 hours. The loss of the squad's primary defensive firepower marked the beginning of the end for German resistance. Individual German soldiers continued fighting with rifles and hand grenades as Soviet infantry entered the farmhouse ruins. But the outcome was never in doubt once organized defensive fire had been eliminated. Richter was killed while attempting to coordinate his men's final defensive efforts, and Hoffmann died at his radio position while transmitting final intelligence reports to German headquarters west of the Dnieper. One by one, the members of Kleist's squad were killed or wounded until organized resistance ceased at 1,247 hours. Kleist survived the final assault with wounds that prevented further resistance but did not immediately threaten his life. Soviet infantry treated German wounded according to international law, providing medical attention and evacuating prisoners to field hospitals where German military doctors worked alongside Soviet medical personnel. The professional conduct of Red Army soldiers toward German prisoners reflected training and discipline that contradicted Nazi propaganda about Soviet military barbarism. Interrogation of German prisoners provided Soviet intelligence officers with detailed information about 7th Panzer Division dispositions, command structure, and planned defensive operations west of the Dnieper. The intelligence gathered from the Reconnaissance Patrol would contribute to planning for Operation Barbarossa, the massive Soviet offensive that would destroy Army Group Center and advance German forces to the gates of Warsaw within 6 weeks. The failed reconnaissance mission had provided the Red Army with information that would facilitate the destruction of the very German forces it had been intended to protect. The 7th Panzer Division's Reconnaissance Battalion ceased to exist as an effective military unit on June 23, 1944, with 36 men killed in action and 12 taken prisoner during the engagement east of the Dnieper. German casualties represented 75% of the force committed to the mission, a loss rate that would have been unsustainable even for units with unlimited replacement personnel. The Reconnaissance Patrol's destruction marked the beginning of Army Group Center's collapse during Operation Barbarossa. Soviet after-action reports credited the success of the anti-reconnaissance operation to careful intelligence preparation, coordinated planning between different combat arms, and disciplined execution by well-trained troops operating advanced equipment. The engagement demonstrated Red Army capabilities that had evolved dramatically since the desperate defensive battles of 1941–42, when Soviet forces had been characterized by numerical superiority offset by tactical incompetence and poor coordination between different types of units. The tactical lessons learned from the destruction of the German Reconnaissance Patrol were incorporated into Soviet training programs and operational planning for subsequent phases of Operation Barbarossa. The ability to detect, track, and destroy small German units operating behind Soviet lines would prove crucial during the advance toward Berlin, when isolated German formations would repeatedly attempt to conduct reconnaissance and sabotage operations against Red Army supply lines and command facilities. Kleist's experience as a prisoner of war provided insight into Soviet military organization and capabilities that contradicted German propaganda about Red Army primitiveness and brutality. Soviet field hospitals were well-equipped and professionally staffed, with medical procedures that compared favorably to German military medicine. Prison camps were organized according to international law, with adequate food, shelter, and medical care provided to German prisoners. Most significantly, Soviet officers demonstrated education and professional competence that rivaled their German counterparts. The intelligence gathered during interrogation of German prisoners revealed the desperate situation facing Army Group Center in the weeks before Operation Bagration began. German units were operating at significantly reduced strength due to casualties and inadequate replacements, with many formations reporting combat effectiveness at less than 50% of authorized levels. Ammunition and fuel shortages were affecting operational planning, and morale problems were becoming apparent even among veteran units like the 7th Panzer Division. Operation Bagration commenced on June 23, 1944, exactly 3 years after the beginning of Operation Barbarossa, with massive Soviet attacks against German defensive positions throughout the central sector of the Eastern Front. The offensive employed 14 million Red Army soldiers, 31,000 artillery pieces, 5,200 tanks and self-propelled guns, and 5,300 aircraft against German forces that totaled fewer than 400,000 men with severely limited armor and air support. The numerical superiority enjoyed by Soviet forces was complemented by tactical sophistication that reflected 3 years of combat experience and military education. The destruction of the 7th Panzer Division's Reconnaissance Battalion had eliminated one of the few sources of tactical intelligence available to German commanders attempting to determine Soviet intentions and capabilities before the offensive began. Without accurate information about Red Army concentrations and planned operations, German defensive preparations were based on assumptions and fragmentary intelligence that proved catastrophically incorrect when the attack began. The failed reconnaissance mission contributed directly to the surprise achieved by Soviet forces during the opening phases of Operation Bagration. German defensive positions west of the Dnieper River were systematically destroyed by concentrated artillery barrages that preceded the main Red Army assault by several hours. Soviet artillery preparation involved more than 120,000 rounds fired against German positions during a 4-hour period, creating devastating effects on personnel, equipment, and fortifications. The barrage demonstrated industrial-scale military production capabilities that allowed the Soviet Union to expend ammunition at rates that German forces could not sustain or counter. Army Group Center's collapse during the first week of Operation Bagration exceeded even Soviet expectations for the offensive's success. Entire German divisions were surrounded and destroyed before they could retreat to prepared defensive positions, with Soviet mobile forces advancing at rates that often exceeded 50 kilometers per day. The 7th Panzer Division, already weakened by the loss of its Reconnaissance Battalion and other combat losses, was surrounded near Minsk and ceased to exist as an effective military unit by July 3, 1944. The fate of individual German soldiers during Operation Bagration reflected the broader catastrophe that befell Army Group Center during the Soviet offensive. Men like Kleist, who had survived 3 years of fighting on the Eastern Front, found themselves prisoners of war in a conflict where German defeat had become mathematically inevitable. The professional competence and numerical superiority of Red Army forces, combined with Germany's declining ability to replace combat losses, had shifted the balance of military power decisively in favor of the Soviet Union. Soviet treatment of German prisoners captured during Operation Bagration varied considerably depending on circumstances and the attitudes of individual Red Army units. Some German soldiers were executed immediately after capture, particularly members of SS units or soldiers identified as having participated in atrocities against Soviet civilians. Others, like Kleist, received treatment consistent with international law and were evacuated to prisoner-of-war camps where they remained until after the war ended. The intelligence value of German prisoners captured during Operation Bagration diminished rapidly as the offensive progressed and German defensive positions collapsed throughout the central sector of the Eastern Front. Information about German unit dispositions and planned operations became irrelevant when those units were destroyed and the operations were cancelled due to circumstances beyond German control. The strategic initiative had passed completely to Soviet forces, making German tactical intelligence largely meaningless. Kleist's survival through 3 years of combat on the Eastern Front, capture during the failed reconnaissance mission, and subsequent imprisonment provided him with a unique perspective on the evolution of Soviet military capabilities between 1941 and 1944. The Red Army forces that had been defeated so decisively during the early months of Operation Barbarossa had been transformed into a professional military organization capable of conducting complex operations against experienced German opponents and achieving decisive tactical and strategic results. The technological superiority that had characterized German forces during the early years of the Eastern Front had been largely eliminated by 1944, when Soviet equipment often exceeded German capabilities in both quantity and quality. T-34 tanks were produced in numbers that allowed replacement of combat losses at rates that German industry could not match, while new Soviet weapons like the IS-2 heavy tank and Katyusha rocket artillery provided capabilities that German forces had no effective means of countering. Training and education standards within the Red Army had improved dramatically during the 3 years between the beginning of Operation Barbarossa and the launch of Operation Bagration. Soviet officers demonstrated tactical competence and strategic understanding that reflected systematic military education and practical combat experience. The primitive command structure and tactical incompetence that had characterized early war Soviet forces had been replaced by professional military leadership capable of coordinating complex operations involving multiple divisions and different types of combat units. The destruction of the 7th Panzer Division's Reconnaissance Battalion on June 23, 1944, marked a symbolic turning point in the Eastern Front campaign, occurring exactly 3 years after German forces had crossed the Soviet border with confidence in quick victory. The failed mission demonstrated that German tactical superiority and professional competence, while still present at the individual and small unit level, were no longer sufficient to overcome Soviet numerical superiority and improving military capabilities. For German military historians studying the Eastern Front campaign, the reconnaissance mission east of the Dnieper represented a classic example of tactical intelligence gathering that failed due to enemy preparation and superior enemy capabilities. The mission's failure contributed to larger strategic failures that resulted in Army Group Center's destruction, but the individual tactical decisions made by German soldiers and officers reflected professional competence and personal courage under extremely difficult circumstances. The families of German soldiers killed during the reconnaissance mission east of the Dnieper received standard notifications from military authorities informing them that their sons and husbands were missing in action and presumed dead. No details were provided about the circumstances of their deaths, as such information was classified under wartime security regulations. The men who died fighting east of the Dnieper became statistics in a war that had already consumed hundreds of thousands of German soldiers on the Eastern Front. Soviet military records of the anti-reconnaissance operation conducted on June 23, 1944, provided detailed analysis of tactics and lessons learned that would be incorporated into training programs for other Red Army units. The successful coordination between artillery, armor, infantry, and aviation during the engagement demonstrated capabilities that would be essential for subsequent operations during the advance toward Berlin. The destruction of the German reconnaissance patrol represented a small but significant contribution to Soviet military education and tactical development. The site where Kleist's squad made their final stand in the destroyed farmhouse east of the Dnieper River shows no trace of the violence that occurred there on June 23, 1944. The building was rebuilt after the war, and the surrounding farmland returned to agricultural production as part of Soviet reconstruction efforts in Belorussia. Occasionally, local farmers discover pieces of military equipment or unexploded ordnance while plowing their fields, but there are no markers to indicate what happened there or to commemorate the men who died fighting each other with professional skill and personal courage. Modern military analysts studying the Eastern Front campaign recognize the reconnaissance mission east of the Dnieper as an example of tactical intelligence gathering that failed due to fundamental changes in Soviet military capabilities between 1941 and 1944. The mission's failure contributed to larger strategic failures during Operation Bagration, but the individual actions of German and Soviet soldiers reflected military professionalism and personal courage under combat conditions that tested the limits of human endurance. The mathematical progression of German defeat on the Eastern Front became irreversible during the summer of 1944, when Soviet industrial production and military capabilities exceeded German capacity to replace combat losses and maintain effective resistance. The destruction of individual units like the 7th Panzer Division's Reconnaissance Battalion represented microcosms of larger strategic realities that would ultimately result in German surrender in May 1945. Kleist's post-war recollections of the failed reconnaissance mission emphasized the professional competence and personal courage displayed by soldiers on both sides during the engagement east of the Dnieper. German and Soviet forces had fought each other with tactical skill and determination that reflected military training and traditions that transcended political ideologies and national loyalties. The war had become a contest between professional military organizations rather than a struggle between competing worldviews. The tactical lessons learned from the reconnaissance mission east of the Dnieper were incorporated into post-war military education programs in both East and West Germany, where the engagement was studied as an example of small unit operations under adverse conditions. The mission's failure provided insight into the importance of accurate intelligence preparation, coordinated planning, and realistic assessment of enemy capabilities when conducting operations behind enemy lines. The legacy of the 7th Panzer Division's Reconnaissance Battalion lives on in German military tradition, where small unit operations during World War II are remembered as demonstrations of tactical competence and personal courage under the most challenging circumstances imaginable. The battalion's destruction during the failed mission east of the Dnieper exemplifies the warrior ethos that German soldiers maintained throughout the war, fighting against increasingly hopeless odds with determination and skill that earned respect from their enemies. For Soviet military historians, the anti-reconnaissance operation conducted on June 23, 1944, represented an early demonstration of Red Army capabilities that would characterize subsequent operations during the advance toward Berlin. The successful coordination between different combat arms, professional execution of complex tactical plans, and effective treatment of prisoners reflected military education and training standards that had evolved dramatically since the desperate defensive battles of 1941–42. The Dnieper River continues its eternal flow past the site where the 7th Panzer Division's Reconnaissance Battalion was destroyed on June 23, 1944, indifferent to the human drama that played out on its banks more than 80 years ago. The rolling hills of Belorussia show no trace of the violence that consumed 48 German soldiers and an unknown number of Soviet troops, but the lessons learned from their final battle continue to influence military education and tactical development in armies around the world.